We've been studying the B-level archetype and the C-level archetype. By now, you probably have a good understanding of the difference between A and B and C levels. In fact, when we talk about org topologies and when we look at the map, we're not just looking at boxes. This reminds me of the time that we were working with our designer. He was proposing to make all the boxes on the map gray because it's just boxes and org design is boring, isn't it? We went like, no, no, this is not true. When we look at the map, we see all these beautiful people and we see how they try to interact with each other. For us, it's really much more than just boxes. We're talking about people. We see people when we look at these boxes.
So we also would like you to see people behind the map or even on the map. Map is just a symbol, is just a schematical representation of what we understand about people's interaction. But in the end, it's all about people, and people should come first. Individual and interactions in the end are over processes and tools and the maps. Okay? So in this bonus lesson for the module 2, we'd like to give you a little bit more highlights on how the maps actually can be used in a real environment where you actually helping an organization to improve its org design.
We feel that the best way to make things more concrete and to convey the information on what archetypes are and how ecosystems work, we think the best way to do that is actually to write about reality in solid case studies. You can find a couple of case studies on our website already, and let's just pick one of them to discuss a little bit more in depth what was going on in this company.
So this is one of the case studies that we have published that is on our website, topologies.com. This story is about a company based in Ukraine, which is called Poster. The company serves a HoReCa business niche, which is essentially software as a service for restaurants and small shops. The software of the company covers the entire end-to-end business rules and business line of somebody who's running a small coffee shop or a restaurant. Typically, it includes things like things you see as a customer, like a QR codes and a menu that you can actually order right from your table. It covers the cashier operations. It covers supply management for whatever you need to order and to refill, your fridges in the restaurant. It covers taxes and legal papers that need to be sent actually in Ukraine in real time to the government to actually control consumption, for example, of alcohol and other goods. So this is a pretty much complex software that has been there on the market for almost 10 years. It is a leader in the market. So if you go to any coffee shop in Ukraine, it is very likely that coffee shop is run by the Poster software.
Well, thanks, Alexei. That's interesting. At least now we have a good overview of, hey, what are you
What?
drinking, Marty?
Oh, I'm sorry. You can have it.
Ah, thanks. It's good tea, actually. So I would be curious to learn from you, Alexei, what the problem was that they had. Why did they call you in? What did they need to fix? I mean, they were already market leader. They were already developing this complex software. Must have had some kind of challenge or problem that they wanted to fix. Please tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So, in fact, I was called in by the C-level suite of the company. They attended my certified less basics class, and they got really interested in the idea of actually bringing back the youth of the company. Like they remember that when they were smaller and younger, they all have this feel of, okay, we are all on this together. And now, 8-ish years later, they have 12 teams. Every team is busy working on its little part of the product. When I went and studied and talked to the team members and the developers, I figured out most of the teams were working on some what you can call a component or a module in a system. There would be a team that is operating the printers, like, all these cafeterias and restaurants. They have actually different printers, different hardware that actually adds this complexity. So if you need to print a check, you'd better do it right. So you need to manage the drivers and everything. So there would be a team that would manage this complexity. And there would be another team that would learn how to send text information to the government of the country where their business is operating. So there would be this 12-ish different teams of different size. And the size of a team actually would be different because the modules would be different in its complexity and the lines of code. So there were 12 teams from 2 to actually 10 people in each team. Big teams had like a team lead person slash a business analyst slash a product owner, was really depending on the team. So some teams had people who are more product oriented people who would prioritize and clarify a backlog for those teams. Smaller teams that were really technically oriented, they would actually pick a senior developer to be a team lead, and that engineer would actually prioritize and manage the work for that team.
Okay, that's clear. Clear setup, 10 teams, but mapping wise, would you assess them to be more Y or A kind of teams already? Because you talked about teams.
Yeah, so looking at org topologies, I would actually classify some of the teams more like Y2 teams, and some teams I would classify as A2 teams. So some teams were more multi component than the others, but in general, they would span from Y2 to A2. So some are Y level, some are A level, and they were pretty much autonomous in the regards that they could do the things they had to do, but also why I would not classify them as Y3 and A3, because there was a dedicated shared UX person, visual designer. There would be a group who would actually assist with translating the user interfaces. There was a different group who was actually, after the feature is done, they would actually go and talk to the customers and configure and enable that feature for the customer. That was called a client onboarding department. It was also a separate functional group doing cloud management and basically kind of deployment related things. That's why I would not call those teams Y3, A3, because they still had dependencies and there was kind of a smallish waterfall happening in development.
Okay, excellent. Thanks. What was the problem or the challenge that made them want to change their current ecosystem?
So when I met the co-founder of the company and his managers, they had been already in a search for some kind of a method that would allow them to be more adaptive. So it's a self-funded startup, and of course things change. So they are operating in developing countries like Ukraine. By the time before the war, it was Russia, and they were also entering the Latin American market. So they were entering these markets where you would expect a lot of changes in the legislation happen. And by this time, I started to work with them. In half a year from then, there would be a very big legislation change in the Ukrainian market. So essentially, what the founder wanted, he wanted to have a method to actually have the company switch direction more easily. He was trying to do this with quarterly OKR cycles. He tried to do it with road mapping. He tried to do it with collecting his product managers and aligning with them. But essentially, we all know how this works. Once you have these 10, 12 teams set up and they own little parts of the product, and every team has its own product owner, team owner rather, and a team level backlog, everybody's busy, everybody's doing something, but then actually nobody sees the bigger picture. And when I talked to the teams, it was actually surprising that actually they saw these dynamics. Why this less adoption essentially, you can say, was a success? Because developers also saw this problem. They say, hey, we are busy, we are putting our skills where we can, but essentially it seems like we're not contributing where we have to be. So we are not actually relevant. Our job, our task, our efforts are not 100% relevant where we want to be. So essentially, the request, the demand for the change was, okay, we need to find a way how to make sure we all work as one team again.
Wow, actually, that's very interesting because in many companies where I go, and probably also the people who are viewing this, they will not have such a brilliant starting point. I mean, there is this thing that you need to fix collaboratively. Everybody knows that this problem is ahead of us, and so there's awareness for the problem, and it's at every layer of the company. So there's this desire for change, and everybody understands the need for change. That would be the first step of things you need to look out for and try to arrange to be able to take such a company or a company along to go upwards towards the higher archetypes.
Yeah, so I was actually really happy with their self awareness. And what I did in the beginning, before we actually start crafting the org blueprints with them, and there were several org blueprints, and we ended up on improving them essentially. But before I asked them to start thinking how they would work, we actually educated everybody. So everybody in the company, every engineer, every manager, they went through a training where we actually did systems thinking and org design. And there was one sign where I actually understood that this would be a success when we were actually doing later on a flip event where we would change the teams from component teams to more feature oriented C level teams. So the moment was when two developers were talking to each other at a coffee machine, and I came to get some water or something, and I overheard them talking. And one said to each other, "Hey, actually, this would be a local optimization if you do this." And once you hear your developers discussing that something is a local optimization and we should not do this, well, now that you know, actually, people have the tool of systems thinking, and well, they will be successful no matter which framework or approach they apply.
Okay, now I'm curious.
Hmm.
The situation in this company was like very favorable to do this move towards hierarchy types.
Yeah.
Did you prepare the organization so that you could immediately go from the current ecosystem to become a C-level organization, or did you plan for intermediate steps? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so because that company was around 50-ish developers, right? My approach, and we discussed this before, if you have around 50 people in a whole company or maybe in a business unit, you don't want to separate them. About 50 people can embark on a journey to go to the high level archetype. If the full company is 50 people, you can just jump, leapfrog to become a C level organization. If you have a big company but you have a group of teams which are about 50 people, then you can help them to become a B level unit from day one. Well, not really from day one. It will take some time for people to get into habits of actually working according to B, but you can put some structures in place on a day one so they actually start working as one unit. So essentially, this was our plan, and I was given about 90 days to actually help them prepare for that flip. So there was no intermediate step planned, but at some point in the middle of this 90 days of a preparation they gave to themselves, at some point, C-level people came up with this sketch. As you can see on the screen, this sketch is what we call an org design blueprint. It's a sketch how a company might look like. And actually, when we teach COTP, Certified Orthopologist Practitioner, which is a 2-day face-to-face class, this is exactly what we teach people to do actually more skillfully. We help people to design different options for their organization. So if you come to our class, you'll be actually skilled to do this properly. So what happened during the preparation phase? The C-level people came with this sketch. As you can see on this picture, there would be one larger group of 4 teams that would work together on the core product. Well, because it's not all the teams, but just a part of the teams, you would classify them as B kind of teams. Well, if they have all the skills together in each team, you would classify them ideally as a B3 unit. And you would classify them as a B3 unit only if there will be some conditions in place. For example, one product owner for all the 4 teams, one list, like one backlog for all the teams, and the teams are more or less equal in the skills, so they can agree and decide who's gonna work on what from the backlog. And actually, this was the idea, to make teams more or less equal in the skills and expertise. So actually, if there's a bigger item in the backlog, several teams can work together at the same time simultaneously on this item. And there would be another 2 areas in the company. One area would be for B2C work. Another area would be for the growth work. Let me tell you a little story how this came to be. So, why would you have a separate team working on, say, B2C product? Well, the founder of the company came and said, you know what? I had always had this idea that we actually need to pivot a little bit and to see if we can actually expand our product offering, not only to B2B, but essentially to B2B2C. What we can do for the visitors, for the guests of the restaurants. And he said, hey, I have this backlog already long time, lying somewhere in my shelf, and we never got to do it. So he said, because we're changing the company, why don't I create a dedicated B2C, B2B2C essentially team that would work off this backlog? And he said for the growth area, yes, we also need to pay attention to product led growth. And by the way, he said, I have this expert, so why don't I give him a team to run, and then they will do all these growth experiments. Okay, so there was this description and motivation behind this, you can say, second org design. The first one was the original one with the component teams, and the second one was with these three areas. And of course, those smaller areas, B2C and growth, you would not classify as a B level archetype. You classify them as A level archetype because it's a single team working on a very small, you can say, subset of features in the product.
So the reasoning of the owner of the company or the CEO person, I can understand, but still it doesn't feel maybe like the best design ever that you could wish for. It's a good step forward, but maybe not the best. So I'm wondering, is this the design that was actually implemented, or were you able to take the company along to take a different route?
Yeah, so this would be an improvement, but to me, being the coach, I held a very high bar for them. I actually wanted them to improve drastically, and this was not good enough, from my opinion. I would be okay if they decided to start like this, but in my experience, if you would go with this org design where several teams working together, but there will be these separated teams, you actually maybe don't understand how those higher archetypes actually work. Because essentially, it took me a couple of weeks to help them see the negative parts, the drawbacks of their proposed org design. And actually, it didn't take long before the developers started to criticize this org design. Developers said, hey, CEO, your goal was actually to come back to the idea of we are all in together, we are a big team. And now you are creating this kind of new fences again. What if we actually work all together, all six teams from one backlog? And essentially, if you want some time, some effort, some teams to be working on this new idea, being B2B2C, or maybe tomorrow you're going to have a new idea, well, you have a backlog, right? You are the ultimate product owner. You can just change the order of the items, and next sprint, some teams will start working on this new idea. And he went like, yes, this will be a more flexible org design because essentially, well, there will be more and more ideas, more and more experiments. And if for every new experiment you need to spawn a new team with a new backlog, with a new backlog owner, essentially you're slowly going back to that initial org design that you actually wanted to stop having. So essentially, Roland, it took a couple of weeks, couple of discussions, and I was facilitating this open space forums where actually everybody could pose a question and make a proposal, this kind of a democratic setup. And essentially everybody agreed, hey, why don't we start all together? One backlog, six equally skilled feature teams will be working there, one product owner being the CEO, and the X team level product owners. Some of them actually went back to the developers, to the teams. Some were promoted to become product managers because essentially they were customer facing product thinkers. And essentially, we started with six teams working together off a single backlog. And I worked with this company for about 6 months as external consultant at their only actually Scrum Master for the scale setup. And I can tell you, they actually didn't have enough time to work on these new ideas. Growth and B2C actually were postponed down the backlog because there were a lot of work that still needed to be done in the core business. After they finished a very big change related to the legislation, then they were able to focus on new things. But this one backlog, essentially for the whole company, which will classify them as a C3 organization and C3 teams within that organization, they provided maximum flexibility and adaptability for the whole company because they've changed direction many times. And then a year later, when the Russian-Ukrainian war actually happened, there were a lot of changes, as you can imagine, in a restaurant business. A lot of restaurants went out of business, etc., etc. So actually, there were a lot of changes, and that setup, I believe, helped them to actually survive and actually stay positive during actually the era of the war. So can you imagine that in the time of a war in Ukraine, they've connected hundreds of restaurants every quarter a year. That's just amazing how actually resilient such organization can be. Yeah. So to finish on the story, my takeaway is that actually adaptivity is not a self-licking ice cream cone. It's just not a thing you do because it's fun. That really changes your organization. It becomes more resilient, and this is a great example of the resilience, maybe the best I've ever heard of.